Picture this. It's spring, 856. A Viking longship cuts through the grey waters of the North Atlantic, salt spray hitting the faces of exhausted warriors. These men have been gone for 6 years, 6 winters. Think about that for a moment. 6 years away from home, raiding monasteries in Ireland, fighting battles in Francia, surviving by their wits and their swords. And now they're sailing back to their Norwegian fjord, and every single one of them is thinking the same thing. What are we going to find when we get home? Because here's the thing about food in the 9th century, it doesn't last. You can't just put something in a freezer. There's no canning technology, no vacuum sealing. Fish, especially, spoils almost immediately. In warm weather, 24 hours and you've got a putrid bacteria-filled mess that'll kill you as surely as any enemy sword. So these warriors, they're expecting the worst. 6 years is an eternity for food to survive. They're bracing themselves for starvation, for skeletal children, for communities on the edge of extinction. The longship beaches. The men climb out, exhausted, weathered, carrying their plunder and their scars. They walk to the storage houses, those dark, cool buildings where communities kept their food supplies, and they crack open the doors. The fish is still good. Not just edible, actually good. Still nourishing. Still safe to eat. 6 winters old, and it might as well have been preserved yesterday. These are hardened men, raiders who've conquered coastal kingdoms across Europe, warriors who've seen things that would make most people's nightmares seem tame. And they stand there, stunned, staring at preserved fish that defied everything they thought they knew about food and time. This wasn't magic. This was mastery. And the people who achieved this mastery, they weren't the warriors. They were the women those warriors had left behind. Now, to understand just how remarkable this is, we need to go back, way back, about 350 years earlier to around 500. After Christ, to a time before anyone was thinking about raids or longships or conquest, a time when the Germanic tribes clinging to Scandinavia's rocky edges were just trying to survive. And survival, let me tell you, survival in Scandinavia was not a given. Think about the geography for a moment. Norway, Sweden, Denmark. These places sit at latitudes where winter doesn't just show up, it dominates. We're talking 6 to 8 months of winter. Temperatures that plunge so deep that exposed flesh freezes within minutes. The kind of cold that makes you understand, on a visceral level, why ancient peoples feared the darkness and the ice. And the growing season? 4 months. Maybe, if you're lucky with the weather. Do the math. You need to produce enough food in 4 months to last through 8 months of brutal winter. That's not a comfortable margin. That's not, oh, we'll figure it out. That's a knife-edge balance between survival and extinction. The Norse peoples understood this. Every settlement huddled along those fjords and coastlines understood this. Winter wasn't just a season, it was the enemy, the ultimate adversary, more dangerous than any rival tribe, more deadly than any wild animal. But Scandinavia had one overwhelming advantage, and it came from the sea: fish. The North Atlantic cod spawned in numbers that sound almost impossible to modern ears. We're talking astronomical populations. Herring migrated in schools so vast they literally darkened the water. You could see them from the shore, a moving shadow beneath the waves. Mackerel filled fishing nets until the boats threatened to capsize from the weight. It was an almost inexhaustible resource, washing up to the shores year after year in staggering abundance. Here's the cruel irony. All that abundance was worthless without preservation. Fish spoils faster than any other food, faster than meat, faster than vegetables. In warm weather, and remember, Scandinavia does have summers, brief but real fish goes bad in 24 hours. Even in cold weather, you've got days at most before bacterial decomposition turns your catch into something that'll kill anyone who eats, which makes them sick. So the Norse people sat next to an ocean filled with food, surrounded by more protein than they could possibly catch, and they were still facing starvation. An abundant resource, completely useless without the knowledge to transform it. In those early centuries, the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries after Christ, failure meant death. Not theoretical death, not statistical death, real, immediate, absolute death. A family tries to preserve meat for winter. It rots, children starve. A community tries to store fish. It spoils. The bloodline ends. This wasn't abstract. This wasn't remote. The Norse peoples faced evolutionary pressure as intense as any military siege you can imagine. Preserve food successfully or cease to exist. Those were the only two options. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Because while the men were out fishing and farming during those brief productive months of summer and fall, it was the women who fought the longer war. The war to make summer's abundance last through winter's scarcity. They became warriors in a different kind of battle. A battle against time. Against bacteria. Against chemistry they didn't understand, and forces they couldn't see. They experimented. They tried hanging fish in the wind. They tried burying fish in what little salt they could obtain. They tried smoking fish over fires, controlling temperature and exposure in a deadly balancing act. Most attempts failed. Some killed entire families with food poisoning, botulism, bacterial infections, toxins they had no names for and no way to understand. A few attempts showed promise, and so, generation after generation, these women refined their techniques. Through observation and bitter experience, they noticed that fish dried in certain wind patterns lasted longer than fish dried in others. They discovered that specific salt concentrations prevented rot, while other concentrations actually accelerated it. They learned that smoke from particular types of wood, birch, alder, preserved better than smoke from other sources. They didn't have microscopes to observe bacteria. They didn't have thermometers to measure temperature. They didn't have chemistry textbooks to understand molecular processes. They had results. Families that ate or families that starved. That was their laboratory. That was their scientific method. Think about the patience this required, the careful observation, the willingness to try again after catastrophic failure, the courage to experiment when a single mistake could kill your children. This wasn't cooking. This was survival science, practiced by people who would never have called it science, who would never have written down their methods, who simply knew that certain actions produce certain results and that was enough. By the mid-700s, just before the Viking Age is about to explode across Europe in 793 with that first raid on Lindisfarne, Norse women had perfected something remarkable. They'd developed multiple preservation methods that, used together, could keep fish edible for years, not months, years. Stockfish cod hung on massive wooden racks, dried by Arctic winds, until it became hard as wood could last 5 to 6 years when stored properly. 5 to 6 winters. Think about that. Fermented fish, packed in brine or buried in specific conditions, developed complex flavors while remaining safe to eat season after season. Smoked fish, treated with salt and hung in longhouse rafters, sustained families through the longest winters. And this knowledge belonged to women. It passed from mother to daughter, from elder to apprentice, in an oral tradition as vital as any saga or battle tale that the men told around fires. A woman who could make fish survive multiple winters gained respect, authority, influence. Her techniques determined whether her community thrived or perished. Master preservers held honored positions because everyone understood the stakes. This knowledge system, invisible to foreign chroniclers who only recorded raids and battles, was about to become the foundation of something much larger than survival. Because here's what those chroniclers missed, what most histories still miss. The Viking Age, the expansion, the conquests, the settlements from Iceland to Constantinople, all of it depended on this preservation knowledge. You can't raid Ireland for 6 years without reliable food. You can't sail to North America without provisions that last months at sea. You can't establish settlements in Iceland without food supplies that sustain you through the first 2 years before your farms become productive. The warriors got the glory, the longships got the attention, the raids got recorded in terrified monks' chronicles, but none of it happens without the women who figured out how to make fish last 6 winters. By the late 800s, Norse population was swelling. Why? Because preservation created reliable food surpluses for the first time in Scandinavian history. More children survived to adulthood. Communities grew beyond their local resources. Land pressure intensified. Young men, energetic, ambitious, Looking for futures that didn't exist in crowded Scandinavian settlements, they started looking outward, to the wealthy monasteries of England and Ireland, just sitting there, undefended, filled with silver and gold, to the trading cities of Francia and the Mediterranean, to unclaimed lands in Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The Viking Age was about to begin. Those longships were about to carry warriors across the known world and into the unknown, but they sailed on provisions women created. Every conquest, every settlement, every voyage into uncharted waters, all made possible by fish that could survive 6 winters. Those warriors returning in 856, standing in front of storage houses, staring at preserved fish that seemed to defy time itself, they witnessed only the final product. They didn't see the decades of experimentation, the generations of failed attempts, the countless women who perfected these techniques through patience, observation, and mastery of their environment. They saw magic, the women saw mastery, and that mastery was about to change the world, because in the next chapter of this story, we're going to meet those women. We're going to stand beside them in Arctic Norway as they process hundreds of fish per day. We're going to learn exactly how they did it, the techniques, the knowledge, the sophisticated understanding of environment and preservation that made the impossible possible. We're going to discover that the Viking Age wasn't built on superior weapons or ships or warrior culture. It was built on fish, and the hands that preserved that fish belonged to women whose names were never recorded, whose work was considered too ordinary to chronicle, but whose expertise shaped European history. The question is, how did they do it? So let's go there. Let's go to the place where this mastery was perfected. Let's go to Lofoten. It's the year 850. Spring is arriving in this chain of islands in Arctic Norway, and when I say Arctic, I mean Arctic. We're talking about a place where the mountains plunge straight into the sea, where the coastline fractures into thousands of jagged edges, where the landscape looks like the world itself is still being born. And this is the heart of the cod fishery. Every winter, these fish arrive to spawn in numbers that are hard to wrap your modern mind around. We're talking about individual cod that weigh 30 to 40 pounds each, millions of them, just showing up, like clockwork, every single year, and the Norse people knew exactly when they were coming. Now, imagine you're a woman named Astrid. She's not a real person, no single woman's name survived in the records from this time, but she represents thousands of real Norse women whose stories were never written down. Astrid is 30 years old. She's the mother of 4 children, and in her community, she's recognized as something special, a master fish processor. When the cod arrive, everyone works. Men and women together, hauling nets that burst with fish. But then, the real work begins. The work that determines whether this abundance becomes survival or just becomes waste. Because here's the brutal reality. These fish must be processed within hours. Not tomorrow, not next week. Hours. The clock is ticking from the moment a cod comes out of the water, and bacteria, though Astrid has no word for bacteria, no concept of microorganisms, bacteria is racing to win. Watch Astrid work. Her hands move with a precision that looks almost violent in its efficiency. Slice. Gut. Split. Clean. A single cod, 40 pounds of fish, processed in under 60 seconds. Think about that. 60 seconds from whole fish to prepared fish, ready for preservation. Her hands are bleeding from the work. The cold numbs her fingers. The smell is overwhelming. She works anyway. On a good day, she and her daughters can process 200 fish. On the best days during peak season, 500 fish pass through their hands. 500 fish. In one day. And every single cut has to be precise, because mistakes mean spoilage, and spoilage means starvation. Now look around Astrid. Look at what she's created, what her community has created. Stretching across the landscape, you see massive wooden racks called hedgel, row after row after row of these structures, built from weathered timber, standing like sentinels across the coastline. The hanging fields of Lofoten. From a distance, they look like some kind of strange forest where fish grow instead of leaves. Thousands upon thousands of cod, split and cleaned, hanging by their tails. The sight is otherworldly, alien. almost. This is stockfish. In Old Norse, they called it turfisk, and this represents the absolute pinnacle of preservation technology in the medieval world. Here's why the Arctic environment is perfect for this. The temperatures hover just above freezing. You've got strong, constant winds, low humidity. It's like nature designed a refrigeration system before refrigeration existed. Over 2 to 3 months, these fish slowly desiccate. The moisture content drops from 80% down to approximately 15%. The transformation is dramatic. Fresh cod feels soft and wet in your hands. Finished stockfish? It's hard as wood. So rigid, you literally have to beat it with mallets before you can cook it. But here's the thing. Astrid doesn't just hang fish and hope for the best. The knowledge required goes so far beyond that simple description. She has to read the weather with the skill of a ship navigator reading stars. If she hangs fish during warm spells, even brief ones, bacteria multiplies and the fish rots before it can dry. If she hangs during rain, moisture prevents proper drying and mold develops. She needs sustained cold, wind and dry conditions. It's a narrow environmental window, and it occurs reliably in only one place on Earth, Arctic Norway. That's not an exaggeration. This geographic advantage gives Scandinavia a preservation monopoly. Other regions can't replicate these conditions. They can try, but their results will never match the quality of Lofoten stockfish. And Astrid knows every variable by instinct rather than measurement. She selects the right cod too fatty and they spoil before drying, too lean and they lack nutrition. She splits them at precisely the right angle to maximize surface area for drying, while maintaining structural integrity. She monitors them throughout the drying process, checking for signs of spoilage, turning them when necessary, moving them to different racks if wind patterns shift. This is not simple labor. This is sophisticated environmental knowledge, practiced by someone who would never have called it science but who understood cause and effect as clearly as any modern food scientist. Now, step inside Astrid's longhouse. It's dark in here, and the air is thick with smoke. Different preservation method, different technique. Fish hang from the ceiling rafters, suspended above slow-burning fires. Birchwood, alderwood, specific types that produce the right kind of smoke. This is the balancing act. Too much heat and the fish cooks, then spoils. Too little heat and bacteria wins the race. Astrid tends these fires for weeks, sometimes months. She's managing temperature without a thermometer, controlling the process through experience and observation. And then there's salt. In Astrid's world, salt is more precious than silver. Think about that. Salt, something you can buy at any grocery store today for a couple of dollars, was a luxury commodity. It arrived through trade routes from Germany and Francia, or it came from backbreaking seawater evaporation, boiling hundreds of gallons of seawater to produce single pounds of salt. Astrid controls her household salt supply with absolute precision. She can't afford waste. Every grain counts. She layers herring in wooden barrels. Fish, salt, creating a preservation system that can last for years. The salt concentration has to be exact. Too much salt, and you're wasting a precious resource. Too little, and the entire barrel spoils. A miscalculation means losing months of work, wasted fish, wasted salt, and potentially hunger. But there's one more preservation method, and this one is going to sound strange to modern ears. Fermentation. Astrid packs smaller fish or salmon in brine. She buries barrels in cool earth or stores them in cellars. She monitors them by smell and intuition, waiting for the exact right moment. The fish is technically decaying. Bacteria is breaking down the flesh, but it's controlled decay. The bacterial process creates an acidic environment that kills dangerous pathogens while preserving nutrition. The result is rakfisk, surströmming, fermented fish that modern people call rotten, that smells so strong it can literally make visitors gag. But to Astrid, this smells like success, like food that will feed her children when snow buries the village and no fresh provisions exist. Foreign visitors to Scandinavia, when they eventually arrive in later centuries, will be horrified by fermented fish. They'll write descriptions calling it putrid, disgusting, inedible. They're wrong. They just don't understand what they're looking at. They're seeing food through the lens of abundance, of choice, of refrigeration. Astrid sees it through the lens of survival, and in that context, fermented fish is a miracle. It takes catches that would otherwise spoil smaller fish, damaged fish, excess that can't be dried or smoked, and transforms them into preserved food. It increases total yield by 30 to 40%. That's not a small margin. In a subsistence economy, that's the difference between survival and starvation. Now, here's something crucial to understand. This knowledge carries spiritual dimensions beyond technique. Astrid lives in a cosmos where Norse gods and goddesses influence every aspect of life. Ran, the goddess of the sea, provides the fish offerings must be made to ensure good catches. Thor's hammer protects the preservation process. Small hammer pendants hang near the drying racks. The Norns, the three fates who weave destiny, ultimately determine whether food lasts or spoils. Preservation isn't just technique. It's ritual. It's prayer. It's cosmic cooperation. And this knowledge passes from generation to generation through a system that looks nothing like modern education, but works with remarkable efficiency. Young girls, 7 or 8 years old, start learning by watching. By age 12, they're processing fish competently. By 15, they understand the subtle variables that separate adequate preservation from mastery. By 20, the talented ones have reputations that extend beyond their home villages. And during preservation season, something remarkable happens. Women gather together for the work. Not just family members, women from across the community, working together, processing hundreds or thousands of fish. They sing, work songs. Songs passed down through generations that help maintain rhythm during repetitive tasks, while transmitting historical knowledge and cultural identity. Stories told while processing fish preserve oral histories, memories, genealogies. Competitions emerge. Whose stockfish hangs straightest? Whose fermentation produces the finest flavor? Whose smoking creates the most beautiful golden color? This isn't drudgery. This is craftsmanship. Art, almost. Women take pride in their work, compete with each other, build reputations, and here's what the male-focused historical chronicles completely miss. This work translates directly to power. In Norse legal tradition, which was actually more progressive than most contemporary European societies, women could own property. Women could demand divorce. And during husbands' absences, which often lasted years during raids or trading voyages, women managed entire estates. A woman recognized as a master preserver gained authority, respect, influence that extended into community decision-making. Think about Freydis Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red. The sagas remember her as fierce, possibly violent, definitely formidable. She led an expedition to Vinland around 1010. The sagas focus on her warrior spirit, but her journey required provisions preserved by women, quite possibly by her own hands. Every historical source describes what she did in Vinland, but nobody talks about how she got there. The fish in her ship's hold, the preservation knowledge that made the voyage possible. Or consider Aud the Deep-Minded, a Norwegian noblewoman who migrated to Iceland around 900, bringing 20 freemen and establishing a prosperous estate. The sagas celebrate her wisdom and leadership. They don't mention that successful settlement required preservation knowledge, that establishing an estate in Iceland meant knowing how to make food last through multiple winters before farms became productive. These women weren't exceptions. They represented a system where female expertise in preservation enabled male military and exploratory ambitions. By 900, the preservation arsenal Norse women commanded included at least 5 distinct methods, each optimized for different purposes: stockfish for long voyages and multi-year storage, salted herring for reliable daily consumption, smoked fish for shorter-term needs and superior flavor, fermented fish for utilizing smaller or damaged catches, fresh fish consumed immediately during harvest season. This wasn't one technique, this was a technological suite, a system of complementary methods that, used together, transformed Scandinavia from a region of chronic food scarcity into a place with reliable surpluses. And surpluses change everything. Surpluses mean population growth. Population growth means land pressure. Land pressure means young men looking for opportunities beyond Scandinavia's crowded settlements. The preservation techniques women perfected were about to enable something much larger than survival. They were about to fuel expansion, conquest, empire, because in the next part of this story, we're going to follow those preserved fish across the Viking world, from Norway to Iceland to Greenland to North America, from Scandinavia to Constantinople to Baghdad. We're going to see how logistics, boring, unglamorous logistics, determined which military campaigns succeeded and which failed. We're going to discover that the great heathen army that invaded England in 865, that Leif Eriksson's voyage to Vinland, that the Varangian Guard serving Byzantine emperors thousands of miles from home, all of it depended on fish that women preserved. The warriors thought they conquered through superior fighting skills, through better ships, through Viking ferocity. They were wrong. They conquered because the women back home figured out how to make fish last 6 winters. The year is 865. A massive Viking force assembles in East Anglia. Chroniclers will later call it the Great Heathen Army, though great might be underselling it, and heathen was definitely how the terrified Christian monks saw it. Historians debate the exact numbers, but we're talking about thousands of Danish and Norwegian warriors. Some sources suggest 5,000, others say more. The sagas claim they came seeking revenge for the execution of Ragnar Lothbrok, if Ragnar even existed, which is a whole other debate. But let's be honest about what's really happening here. This invasion isn't primarily about revenge or honor or Viking codes. It's about land hunger. It's about overcrowding in Scandinavia. It's about young men with energy and ambition, but no inheritance, no farmland, no future except what they can carve out with their swords. And beneath all of that, beneath the glory and the legends and the violence, there's a simpler, more fundamental truth. This invasion is logistically possible only because of what's in the ship's holds. Let me show you the math. Because logistics in warfare is always about math, even when nobody's writing it down. 5,000 warriors, each warrior consuming approximately 1 pound of fish per day. That's conservative active warriors, probably 8 more. But let's stick with 1 pound, 5,000. Warriors times 1 pound times 365 days equals over 900 tons of food annually. 900 tons. In fresh form, this is impossible. Completely impossible. You couldn't transport it. You couldn't store it. It would spoil within days, maybe hours in warm weather. The entire military operation would collapse under its own logistical weight. But in preserved stockfish form, the weight reduces to approximately 200 tons, still massive but manageable across multiple longships. And here's the crucial part. Stockfish remains edible for years. The provisions loaded onto ships in Norway in 863 are still perfectly safe to eat in 866, in 867, in 868. This logistical advantage explains Viking military success better than any explanation about warrior culture or superior fighting skills or intimidating longships. Think about it from the English perspective. Anglo-Saxon armies had to return home for harvest seasons. They depended on local agriculture. They couldn't sustain year-round campaigns far from their estates. Their logistics chained them to the land, to the seasons, to the agricultural cycle. Vikings, supplied with multi-year preserved fish, could winter in enemy territory. They could maintain military pressure continuously. They could just wait. Wear down the opposition through sheer persistence. That's not a fair fight. That's not even really a fight. That's a siege where one side has unlimited provisions and the other side is watching the calendar, knowing they have to go home soon, or their own farms will fail. Now jump back 20 years to 845. Another famous Viking operation, Ragnar Lothbrok, possibly the same figure from legend, possibly someone completely different, leads a fleet of 120 ships up the Seine River. They reach Paris, and they sit there, besieging the city for months. King Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, ruler of West Francia, eventually pays 7,000 pounds of silver to make them leave. 7,000 pounds of silver. That's an astronomical sum. But here's what the chronicles don't explain clearly. Why did Charles pay? Was it because he couldn't defeat the Vikings militarily? Maybe. The Vikings were formidable fighters, but the Frankish forces outnumbered them. They had fortifications. They had the home field advantage. No, Charles paid because his forces couldn't outlast the Vikings. The Franks had supply lines to maintain. They had harvest seasons to worry about. They had an entire kingdom's logistics to manage. The Vikings, sitting outside Paris, were eating provisions their women preserved years earlier. They could maintain that siege indefinitely, through winter, through spring, however long it took. When you're defending against an enemy that doesn't need to go home, that doesn't depend on local supply chains, that can just sit there applying pressure month after month after month, eventually, you pay them to leave. It's not surrender, exactly. It's brutal economic calculation. Now let's jump forward, way forward, to around 1000 after Christ. A ship leaves Greenland heading west into unknown waters. The leader is Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, member of one of Iceland and Greenland's most prominent families. He's heard stories, rumors, really about land spotted west of Greenland. Bjarni Herjolfsson supposedly saw coastline on a voyage that got blown off course. Maybe it's real. Maybe it's not. Leif decides to find out. The journey covers perhaps 1,500 miles across open ocean. No land in sight for days, maybe weeks. Just water. Sky, wind, hope. Think about the provisions required for this voyage. You're sailing into the unknown with no idea how long the journey will take, no idea what you'll find, no guaranteed food sources on the other side. Fresh provisions would spoil long before landfall. Salted provisions would require barrels and barrels of precious salt. Smoked fish would last longer but has limited storage life. Stockfish? Stockfish could sustain the crew for weeks at sea, months if necessary. And once they reached land, this place they'd later call Vinland, the stockfish provided provisions during initial settlement attempts. The Vinland settlement ultimately failed. Conflicts with indigenous peoples. The massive distance from Scandinavia making resupply impossible. The simple fact that establishing permanent presence in North America from Greenland was probably beyond the logistics of the era, but it succeeded long enough to establish European presence in North America 500 years before Columbus, 5 centuries before the Age of Discovery. And that temporary success depended entirely on preservation technology. Without stockfish, Leif Erikson doesn't make that voyage. Without multi-year preserved provisions, there's no settlement attempt. The whole thing doesn't happen. Now let's go even further east, all the way to Constantinople. Beginning in 988, Byzantine emperors hired Scandinavian warriors as elite bodyguards. The Varangian Guard. These weren't just regular soldiers, these were the emperor's personal protection, his most trusted military force. Think about the journey these men made, from Norway or Sweden, travelling thousands of miles through Russia via river routes, down the Volga or the Dnieper, through hostile territory, past rival tribes and competing kingdoms, eventually reaching the Black Sea and Constantinople. This journey took months, and once they arrived, they served for years, sometimes decades, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by a completely different culture, speaking a different language, eating different food well, mostly different food, because they brought their own provisions, or more accurately, provisioning systems connected Scandinavia to the Mediterranean specifically to supply these warriors. Constantinople's markets in the year 1000 contained a sight that must have seemed bizarre to Byzantine merchants. Rock-hard dried fish from Arctic Norway, preserved so long it seemed impossible, traded alongside silk from China and spices from India and wine from Mediterranean vineyards. Byzantine traders recognized commercial opportunity. Norse merchants exchanged preserved fish for Byzantine silver, for Arab gold, for luxury goods that would never be produced in Scandinavia. The fish women preserved in Lofoten appeared in markets throughout the medieval world: Dublin, York, Novgorod, Baghdad, North Africa. Anywhere Norse traders reached, preserved fish followed. And then there's Iceland, the settlement that might be the most impressive preservation-enabled achievement of all. Settlement begins around 870. Iceland is uninhabited. A few Irish monks had been there, but they left. It's a volcanic island in the North Atlantic with limited agricultural potential, harsh climate, long winters, short growing seasons. The first settlers faced a brutal calculation. You need approximately 2 years' worth of food to establish a functioning farm. First harvest won't occur for 18 to 24 months after arrival. That's assuming nothing goes wrong, assuming you survive the first winter, assuming your seeds grow, assuming you figure out farming in an entirely new environment. Without multi-year preserved provisions, primarily stockfish Iceland would have remained uninhabited. It's that simple. But Norse settlers arrived with provisions their women preserved. They survived those first brutal years. They established farms. They adapted preservation techniques to the Icelandic environment. And within a few generations, Iceland had its own stockfish industry, its own preservation expertise, its own women passing down knowledge through matrilineal lines. Today, Iceland's population descends from those initial settlers. An entire nation exists because Norse women figured out how to preserve fish for years. Now watch what happens as Christianity spreads through Scandinavia. Norway officially converts around 1000 under King Olaf Tryggvason. Though officially is doing a lot of work there, Olaf basically forced conversion at sword point. Sweden follows by 1100. Denmark converted earlier, around 960 under Harald Bluetooth. Christianity brings massive changes to Norse society. New laws, new social structures, new relationships with European kingdoms. But economically, the most significant change involves dietary restrictions. Catholic Europe observes approximately 150 meatless fast days annually. Every Friday, that's 52 days right there. The entire 40-day Lent period. Various saints' feast days. Holy observances throughout the church calendar. On these days, eating land animal meat is forbidden. But fish? Fish is permitted. Fish is encouraged. Fish is spiritually appropriate. Suddenly, and I mean suddenly in historical terms, over just a couple of decades, preserved fish transforms from subsistence food to commercial commodity in massive demand. Let me give you the market calculation, because this is where it gets staggering. Catholic Europe around 1000 contains approximately 50 to 60 million people. Not everyone is strictly observant. Not everyone follows all the fast day requirements. But even if only 10% of the population strictly observes fast days, a conservative estimate, that's 5 to 6 million consumers requiring fish 150 days per year. 5 to 6 million times 150 days equals 750 to 900 million servings of fish annually. 750 to 900 million servings. That's not a niche market. That's not regional trade. That's one of the largest commodity markets in medieval Europe. And Scandinavia, with its preservation, technology monopoly, is perfectly positioned to supply it. Bergen, Norway, emerges as the epicenter of this economic revolution. By 1150, Bergen has become one of Europe's wealthiest cities, not because of military conquest, not because of political power, because of stockfish. Ships arrive from across Catholic Europe, England, France, Germany, the Low Countries, even Mediterranean regions, despite having their own fishing industries, because Norwegian stockfish has quality and preservation duration nobody can match. The Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of German merchant cities that would dominate northern European trade for centuries, establishes permanent presence in Bergen by the 1200s. They recognize the gold mine when they see it, but here's where a bitter irony emerges. And it's an irony we need to sit with for a moment, because it reveals something fundamental about power and recognition and how history gets written. As the stockfish trade explodes into massive commercial enterprise, the women who developed and continue to perform the preservation work become increasingly invisible in historical records. Male merchants control distribution networks. Male traders capture most profits. Trade agreements, tax records, commercial contracts all mention male names while ignoring the thousands of women processing millions of fish annually. The knowledge remains with women. The actual preservation work remains women's work. The expertise that makes the entire system possible stays in female hands. But credit, compensation, historical recognition, those flow to male merchants. Hanseatic traders in Bergen grow wealthy from fish they neither catch nor preserve. They're middlemen, essential middlemen, granted, but middlemen nonetheless in a system that depends entirely on women's expertise. Yet women's names disappear from commercial records. Their work becomes invisible. Too common, too domestic, too obviously women's work too. Merit recording. Aud the Deep-Minded appears in Icelandic sagas because she was unusually wealthy and powerful, a noble woman who commanded resources and respect. Her story survived because she was exceptional. But 10,000 ordinary women preserving fish? No mentions, no commemorations, no recognition in historical records. Their work was the foundation of Norse expansion and medieval Europe's largest food trade, and their ghosts in the historical record. By 1066, the year the Viking Age traditionally ends with Harald Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge and William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings, the preservation-based economy has already transcended Norse military power. Scandinavian kingdoms settle into medieval European patterns. They become Christian kingdoms. The longships stop raiding. The age of Viking terror ends. But the stockfish trade? The stockfish trade continues expanding. The fishing boats never stop hauling. The women never stop preserving. The warriors are done. The merchants are just getting started. And the women who made it all possible continue doing what they've always done, transforming abundant but perishable resources into provisions that can survive 6 winters, and then selling the results to a European market that can't get enough. The Vikings may have ended, but the fish economy they built on women's knowledge, that's just beginning its most profitable centuries. The 13th century transforms Bergen into something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a city built almost entirely on dried fish. By 1250, the Hanseatic League dominates the trade. German merchants control the counting houses, the trading offices, the warehouses, the distribution networks. They've established what's essentially a commercial empire, and it's built on fish that Norwegian women preserve using techniques unchanged for 500 years. Think about that for a moment. 500 years of continuity, the same cuts, the same racks, the same weather reading, the same months-long drying process. While empires rise and fall, while kingdoms transform, while Christianity replaces Norse paganism, while the entire political map of Europe redraws itself multiple times, the women in Lofoten keep hanging fish on wooden racks exactly as their ancestors did. German merchants control the money. Norwegian women control the knowledge. And the knowledge? The knowledge is what matters. The timing, the weather reading, the quality assessment that determines whether a particular fish will last 1 winter or 6 winters. That expertise can't be written down in contracts, can't be transferred to merchant houses, can't be bought or sold or stolen. It stays with the women, passed mother to daughter, elder to apprentice, generation after generation. But then something happens that threatens to break this chain entirely. 1349. The Black Death arrives in Norway. Now, if you know anything about the Black Death, the plague that would kill between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population, you know this isn't a minor disruption. This is apocalyptic. This is civilization ending in many regions. Entire fishing villages disappear. Not metaphorically, literally. Everyone dies. Buildings stand empty. Boats rot in harbours. Fishing nets decay on abandoned racks. And the preservation knowledge, passed orally from mother to daughter for centuries, faces potential extinction. Because when bloodlines end, oral traditions end with them. Think about a village of 200 people, 30 to 40 women who know the preservation techniques at expert level. The plague arrives. Within months, maybe 120 people are dead. Among the survivors, perhaps only 10 to 15 women remain, and maybe only 3 or 4 of them were expert preservers. The margin for error just got terrifyingly thin. If those few surviving women die before teaching the next, our generation, if there is a next generation, centuries of accumulated knowledge disappears forever, not written in books, not preserved in manuscripts, just gone. But it doesn't disappear. Enough women survive, enough daughters remember their mother's teachings, enough communities maintain just barely enough continuity. The knowledge thread holds, stretched desperately thin but unbroken. When Norway's population recovers in the 1400s slowly, painfully, over generations, stockfish production resumes at previous levels. The techniques survived the people who held them. That's resilience on a level that's hard to fully appreciate. The knowledge proved more durable than the population itself. Now jump forward to 1517. The Protestant Reformation begins when Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. This is supposed to change everything. And in many ways, it does. Religious upheaval transforms Europe. Wars of religion will rage for over a century. The Catholic Church's absolute authority fractures. Christianity splits into competing denominations. But the fish trade? The fish trade barely notices. Protestant regions still observe meatless days, though fewer than Catholic ones. Catholic regions, reacting to Protestant challenges, intensify devotional practices which actually increases fish consumption. The Council of Trent, the Catholic Church's response to Reformation, emphasizes traditional practices including dietary restrictions. The market remains robust. Bergen's importance continues through the 1500s and 1600s. Norwegian stockfish feeds Europe through the 30 Years' War, through the wars of religion, through the English Civil War, through every upheaval that transforms medieval Europe into early modern Europe. The kingdoms change, the religions change, the political systems change. The fish keeps drying on the same racks using the same methods, and in remote fishing villages, far from merchant houses and historical records and political changes, women continue preservation work exactly as their ancestors did. Picture a woman in Lofoten in 1650. Her name is lost to history, but she's processing cod using identical techniques as her ancestor in 850, 800 years of separation. Same cuts, same racks, same weather reading, same months-long drying process. 800 years of political changes, religious transformations, and social upheavals. The knowledge remains constant. That's cultural continuity on a scale that's almost hard to believe. But it's real. Documented through archaeological evidence, confirmed by analysis of historical preservation sites, verified by the simple fact that traditional techniques, still practiced today, produce results identical to medieval stockfish. Now the Industrial Revolution arrives in the 1700s. Steam engines, factories, mass production, new technologies that transform European economies. But the Industrial Revolution arrives late to Arctic Norway. Very late. Through the 1800s, while locomotives connect European cities and telegraph cables span continents and factories belch smoke over Manchester and Birmingham and the Ruhr Valley, Lofoten's fishing villages maintain traditional patterns. Modernization seems poised to make ancient preservation techniques obsolete. Why dry fish for months when you could eventually, theoretically, process them industrially? But it doesn't happen. Stockfish remains cheaper to produce than industrially processed alternatives. It requires no fuel beyond wind and cold, no complex equipment beyond wooden racks, and it commands premium prices from consumers who've been eating this specific product for centuries and don't want substitutes. The old ways survive because they're not just tradition, they're economics, they work, they're profitable. Then the 20th century brings real threats, the kind of threats that make the Black Death look straightforward by comparison. Refrigeration technology develops rapidly after 1900. Within a few decades, you can freeze fish in hours, keep it preserved indefinitely with reliable electrical refrigeration, transport it anywhere in refrigerated ships and railway cars. Why would anyone dry fish for months when you can freeze it instantly? The economic logic seems overwhelming. Traditional preservation should become obsolete, a historical curiosity. Something grandparents remember but grandchildren never learn. Young people start leaving fishing villages for urban opportunities. The cities offer factories, offices, universities, lives that don't revolve around brutal seasonal work, processing thousands of fish in Arctic weather. Traditional knowledge faces potential extinction not from plague or war, but from economic irrelevance and generational discontinuity. But something unexpected happens, something that nobody in the 19th century would have predicted. As Norway modernizes and urbanizes through the 1900s, cultural appreciation for traditional foods grows stronger, not weaker, stronger. Norwegian Americans in the upper Midwest, descendants of immigrants who left Norway generations earlier, maintain lutefisk traditions with almost religious devotion. Stockfish soaked in lye, producing something that looks bizarre and smells overwhelming and tastes like heritage, like connection, like identity. Annual lutefisk dinners in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota churches preserve traditions that began over 1,000 years earlier. These aren't historical reenactments. These are living traditions, maintained by communities that may be several generations removed from Norway, but still define themselves partly through these preserved fish dishes. In Norway itself, artisanal food movements rediscover traditional preservation methods. By 1970 and 1980, chefs start celebrating stockfish, rakfisk, and other preserved fish as cultural treasures rather than poverty food. What had been considered old-fashioned becomes fashionable. Restaurants in Oslo and Bergen feature traditional preserved fish with premium pricing. The same techniques that once meant survival now mean authenticity. Food critics write reviews praising the complex flavors of properly prepared stockfish. The same product that medieval peasants ate out of necessity, wealthy modern diners now pay premium prices to experience. It's a complete inversion of value systems, and it saves the traditional knowledge from extinction. Meanwhile, archaeology provides new understanding of what these women actually achieved. Excavations at Viking Age settlements uncover specialized fish processing tools in women's graves. Not just generic knives, specialized designs, specific blade shapes optimized for particular cuts, fish hooks, line weights, storage containers. These artifacts suggest women weren't merely processors handling fish men caught. They were active participants in fishing itself. They controlled the entire production chain from catch to preservation to storage to distribution. Runic memorial stones commissioned by women demonstrate economic power. These stones were expensive. Commissioning one meant controlling significant wealth. Several surviving examples show women commemorating husbands, sons, or other family members and paying for these commemorations themselves. They had money. They had status. They had recognized economic roles beyond domestic labor. Analysis of preservation sites reveals sophisticated environmental knowledge that's hard to overstate. Women positioned drying racks to optimize wind patterns based on microclimate variations. They understood bacterial growth at practical, if not theoretical, levels. They developed techniques that modern food scientists, analyzing with advanced equipment, recognize as highly effective. Methods that minimize dangerous bacterial growth while maximizing nutrition retention. These weren't lucky accidents. This wasn't primitive fumbling. This was sophisticated empirical science practiced by people who would never have called it science, but who understood cause and effect as clearly as any modern researcher. The feminist historical movement, beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, explicitly reclaims Norse women's work as historically significant. Scholars start asking new questions. If preservation enabled Viking expansion, doesn't that make women central to Viking Age history rather than peripheral? If women controlled crucial economic resources, why did historical narratives erase them? How do we rewrite medieval history when we recognize that logistics mattered more than battles, that food production mattered more than warfare, that women's invisible labor was actually the foundation of empire? The reframing positions women not as victims or auxiliaries, but as strategic actors whose expertise made everything else possible. And today, Norway's stockfish industry generates approximately 40 million euros annually in exports. 40 million euros from dried fish. In the 21st century, Italy remains the largest importer. Italian cuisine incorporates stockfish in traditional dishes like bacalao preparations that trace directly back to medieval trade patterns. The recipes are centuries old. The fish is still coming from the same place, preserved using the same methods. Nigeria has become a major market. Nigerian cuisine uses stockfish in traditional soups and stews, adding protein to dishes that define West African food culture. From Arctic Norway to West Africa, preservation techniques developed by Norse women a millennium ago still feed millions of people. In Lofoten, tourists photograph the iconic fish-drying racks that define the island's visual identity. The racks are picturesque, photogenic. They appear on postcards and Instagram and travel documentaries. Most visitors don't understand what they're looking at. They see historical charm, quaint tradition, scenic landscape. They don't realize these racks represent technology over 1,000 years old that's still in active commercial use. They don't realize they're looking at a working industrial site, a factory without walls producing one of Norway's most valuable exports. The landscape tourists find picturesque is actually where the work happens, where it's always happened. In small fishing communities, elderly women still teach granddaughters preservation techniques. The knowledge chain remains unbroken despite every threat: plague, economic change, modernization, urbanization, refrigeration, globalization. A woman in Lofoten in 2025, teaching her granddaughter to read weather patterns and judge drying conditions, it connects directly to ancestors. In 825, through unbroken matrilineal transmission of expertise, the hands that hang fish today move with the same practiced efficiency as hands 1,000 years ago. The cuts are the same, the racks are the same, the weather reading is the same, the fundamental knowledge is the same. That's not nostalgia. That's not historical reenactment. That's living tradition, continuous practice, unbroken transmission of knowledge across 40 generations. So let's go back to where we started. Those warriors returning to Norway in 856, standing in front of storage houses, staring at fish, preserved 6 winters earlier, still edible, still nourishing. They were stunned. They saw magic, the impossible made real, but they were wrong about what they were seeing. It wasn't magic, it was mastery. Accumulated wisdom from generations of observation, experimentation, and expertise. Sophisticated understanding of environment, bacteria, chemistry, and time, all practiced without microscopes or thermometers or chemistry textbooks, but practiced with an effectiveness that defied time itself. The warriors saw mystery where women saw knowledge. They saw miracle where women saw the predictable result of techniques perfected over centuries. And here's the final truth, the thing that ties this entire story together. The true Viking legacy isn't conquest. Conquest ended in 1066 at Stamford Bridge and Hastings. Those battles are remembered, studied, analysed, but they're over. They ended nearly 1,000 years ago. The true Viking legacy isn't exploration. The settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland are historically important, but they're historical. They're past events. The true Viking legacy is cultural continuity. It's knowledge preservation. It's techniques so effective they outlasted every empire, survived every plague, adapted to every economic transformation, and continue feeding the world today. The women who made this possible couldn't read or write. Their names appeared in no chronicles. Their work was considered too ordinary, too domestic, too obviously women's work to merit recording. But they created technology that shaped European history. They developed techniques that enabled exploration and conquest. They built economic systems that generated wealth for centuries. They preserved knowledge across 40 generations of continuous practice. The longships rotted centuries ago. They're in museums now, reconstructions and archaeological remains, objects of historical study. The swords rusted. They're museum pieces, archaeological artifacts, things we study to understand the past. The warriors died and were mostly forgotten. A few names survive in sagas and chronicles. Most are lost to history. But the fish? The fish still hangs drying in Arctic winds, still preserved by women's hands, still sustained by women's knowledge, still feeding millions of people across the world. 1,000-year testament to invisible mastery, to knowledge preserved not in books, but in practice, to expertise, passed mother to daughter in an unbroken chain that defied plague, war, economic upheaval, technological change, and historical erasure. Those warriors couldn't believe how Viking women preserved fish that survived 6 winters. Now you know why. Now you know how. Now you know that the survival of that fish for 6 winters wasn't the remarkable part. The remarkable part was the survival of the knowledge itself. Across not 6 winters but 1,000 years of winters. Preserved like the fish, passed down like the fish. Still here, still practiced, still feeding the world. That's the story they never told. Until now.